Alright guys, so today we're going to be covering the basics of Substance Painter. There are a lot of features of Substance Painter, but we're only going to be able to go through, some of them, the ones that are most important to get you started going into the program. I've been using Substance Painter since the summer, so gotten around it a bit. So the first thing that you should do is you should have your model in Maya, and you should export it from Maya. So when you do that, you should have everything UV'd correctly. You want things to look nice, have all the squares all nicely done and things like that. Because when you're using Substance Painter, a lot of the substances you're going to be using, because you can free paint, but a lot of the things you're going to be doing is using procedural materials and building upon that. And if you don't have your object properly UV'd, then the procedural materials are going to get messed up, and you're really not going to be able to fix them manually by hand in Substance Painter because it's all based on your UV mesh. So make sure you have your UVs exactly how you want them first before you go into Substance Painter. So exporting from Maya to Substance Painter is pretty simple. Really, all you want to do is you have your geometry. And this is like a pretty low poly version of this trunk. I didn't really need it to be any higher version. It's not going to be moving around much, but something in Substance Painter is when you bring these things in, Substance Painter does not have smoothing like Maya does. When you render in a render in Maya, such as Arnold, you can use smoothing instead of having to add more geometry, and I prefer to do that. But when you're in Substance Painter, you can't do that. So what you can do is, I have the UVs laid out for this trunk already, well, for the parts that I'm demoing at least. And then what you can do is you make a copy of the trunk. So I have leather trunk high and leather trunk low, high. So basically this is an exact copy. So what you can do is you can go to mesh, smooth. Usually works fine for me, or you can just take a higher resolution, or you can just make a higher resolution model to begin with. You just don't want it to be all chunky when you're doing your textures in Substance Painter because you're not going to be able to tell what it's going to look like. So after you've smoothed the thing, if you look at the UVs for these things, for the lids, for example, they're exactly the same UVs, and this is just the standard smooth tool. It's not. I didn't modify it anywhere or check any boxes. The UVs are exactly the same. The borders of the UVs are exactly the same, and they're generally like all the edges are still in the same place. As you can see right here, it's just that there's more and it's smoother. So when you apply this back onto your model here, after you paint it on this version and then apply it back here after the end of the process, and you press 3, it should lay over the same way as you see it in Substance Painter when you're using this higher definition model. So what you want to do is you want to take the parts that you want to texture. In my case, these 3. Why is it not? And then go to File, Export Selection. And what you want to do is you want to export it as an FBX, because the FBX retains all the information that you need. So I have FBX low and FBX high, but I'll be using FBX high. One more thing before leaving Maya. You don't have to do this, but sometimes it's easier if you have multiple materials in one scene, is if you assign a material to your, if you just assign a Lambert to your material, to your geometry, and you name it, trunk lid. Because when it shows up, because you're exporting as an FBX, so when Substance Painter imports that, it won't import the Lambert texture, but it will import the name. So if you have everything as like Lambert 1, Lambert 2, Lambert 3, it can be kind of hard to tell, and it can slow down your workflow. Before you export, though, you do have to make sure everything has a different texture. And if everything is Lambert 1, you're going to have you're not going to be able to color things separately if you're using procedural materials. You will be able to if you're using, it gets kind of weird. You should just make sure like the lid is a separate Lambert, a separate Lambert, then the sign on here is a separate Lambert, then like the belt, So then you can color everything separately and have it all be neat and orderly. Also, when you organize your scene, it should be all neat too. So I was originally going to use this model to demo this, but then I decided it wasn't a good idea just because it's just leather and there's not a ton of layering. So that's the process for how to get it out. Yeah, Matthew?
So, but if we only had like one mesh for our model, would we only need one material?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
If you only have like a body with no clothing or anything, or you want to paint the whole thing at once, the whole thing should be one material. It's all based on the needs of your character, their accessories, things like that. But common sense, like if you were to texture this in Photoshop or just straight in Maya, if the character would be one material, it's the same for going into Substance Painter. So opening up Substance Painter, I have this thing that this little crane sign that I made for one of my personal projects. So I'll just be demoing it on this because I think it's a good example. So when you come into Substance Painter, the first thing to know about Substance Painter is it's a lot like Photoshop. The people who made Substance Painter specifically designed it to be like Photoshop because they were thinking about, usability. And it's really nice because if you know how to use Photoshop, you basically know how to use Substance Painter, except for some of the fancy buttons, because it's basically just like Photoshop in 3D. So first thing you want to do is, I'm not going to actually be doing this because I already have the things pre-baked in here, but first thing you're going to want to do is go into File and New. So when you click New, it's going to say that, which is dumb, which is why I'm going to open a second window of Substance Painter. It'll only take a second. So when you go to File, New, this window will pop up. You're going to want to leave the template to PBR Metallic Roughness. It's usually what most people use. There's not really a ton of shifting around a ton. There are different things if you want to use Unity that are better suited for making the textures for certain programs. But for the sake of this demo and for the sake of most of the textures you guys are going to be doing in Maya, PBR Metallic Roughness is good. So here's where you select your mesh. Click Select. And then so I have my leather trunk high FBX, and I open that. Normal map format, you can leave that as DirectX, and document resolution is the resolution of your textures on top of your model. But you can always change that in Substance Painter. It's a non-destructive workflow, which is really great. So I'd say 120 and 1024 is a perfectly good thing to start off at. So you press OK, and you see I have the parts of my trunk that I exported in my FBX. So then the next thing you're going to want to do when you're, for the Arnold workflow, next thing you're going to want to do is just bake your maps. So because Substance Painter uses procedural materials, it doesn't have to, but they're nice. What you want to do is you have to bake certain maps, like as you can see right here, your normal, world space, ID, ambient, curvature, position, thickness. These things will help Substance Painter sense the edges of your mesh, the cavities of your mesh, using curvature and things like that. And when you're applying materials like dirt, when you're using smart masks, edge wear, that'll help you a lot in your texturing process. So before we do that, actually, yeah. So one thing before baking the maps is, it might be helpful to know the general way of navigating around Substance Painter. It's basically the same as Maya. Again, they tried to make it as easy as possible to jump into this program, considering that you probably knew other programs. So it's just Alt, click, left click, rotate, Alt, right click to pan, to zoom in and out like this, and then middle click, Alt middle click to move. But anyway, so to bake your maps, you go to Bake Textures here in Texture Settings, and that will be down here. This is the default layout. I haven't changed any. I like the default format. But if you're on any of the other viewers over here, go to Texture Setting, and you want to go Bake Textures. So if you already have a more normal map for this, something like if you already have a bump map or details that you made in Mudbox that you already baked out to be a normal map, you can just, click on any of these and import a map. And that can be done by this little button here on the side. You can import, add resources, you can add pictures, etc. you have to define them as something. Usually that would be a texture. Import your resources to, I'd say, like current session or the project. And after you import that, you can like drag it on and use it as a map for any of these things that you have already. But assuming that you don't, you go to bake maps, and this is where you can bake your maps. We're not going to go over baking ID maps today because we only have a certain amount of time, but those can be helpful, and there's something you might want to look into later. So we uncheck that because we don't really want to spend the extra time baking that. So the output size is important because it's the detail of your baked map, like how much detail it's going to get. So you know, the higher usually the better. Some of them it doesn't matter as much as others, but I think a good one to stick to it might be like 2048. It's not too high as 4K, but it's not too low, so you might get weird resolution things.
And 2048 is the standard size, the default setting for Maya, so it's probably true.
Yeah. So you select your output size, and then basically you just click Bake All Texture Sets or Bake the current texture set. There are extra settings here, so if you want to bake your normal maps in Substance Painter, you can by uploading a high and a low mesh. As of now, I feel like I would recommend learning how to do it in Maya because it's important to learn how to do that in Maya, but also I think it's slightly better than in Substance Painter because weird things kind of happen in Substance Painter sometimes. These things you don't really need to worry about all that much. So you just click Bake All Texture Sets and it'll bake the maps. And the maps are just the computer taking the mesh and generating this information about about your object. So again, where the cavities are, where the edges are, and I can use these to sense smart materials later and help you in your workflow. Since I'm not going to be using this to demo it actually. I'm using this because I've already baked all the maps on this thing, so it won't take any time, because usually baking maps takes a little bit of time.
Sorry, what was the thing you said that was better in Maya that we should learn to do?
Just baking normal maps when you have, because usually if you go into, say, Mudbox and you make details like skin pores, or in your case like little specks of dirt, etc., things like that, and then you want to have that on your that detail on your lower resolution mesh, you can bake a normal map to try to capture some of that detail, and that you can then apply that map so it appears when you're rendering. But you can do that process using your lower resolution mesh and your higher resolution mesh that's made in Mudbox in Substance Painter, but Substance Painter can be a bit slow about that, can be a little bit wonky in my opinion, and I think it might be good to do it in Maya, because Maya has all the baking functionality, and it's probably a little bit more powerful than Substance Painter about it. So coming into Substance Painter with this sign, everything's all baked, I'm basically ready to texture. Yeah. Basically ready to texture. So the UI for this is pretty simple. It's a lot like Photoshop. You don't really have to worry too much about all the the menu up here. You have your file menu, it has things, edit, but it's not, most of the things really aren't up here. So the first thing you want to know is usually when you first bake out a material, there will be this one layer, just a blank layer in your layers menu. And this layers menu is where you're going to be controlling your materials, doing your painting, etc. The texture set list over here is where you have your texture sets. So this is what I mean when I was saying you have several textures, like one for your hat, one for your body, one for your shoe, I don't know, when you make it in Maya. So I didn't do a good job here because I was lazy. So this is Lambert 4 and this is Lambert 5. Don't do that. Do it like I did here, where it's plaque, trunk bottom, trunk top. Makes it much easier when you have super huge files with tons of textures and tons of things to texture in them. Don't be like me and do this. So here, once you figure out which one is which in this case, you can change between which ones you're texturing. So this one would be the main sign, and this one would be the pole. So you have to be on the text, on the on the material you're texturing, on the texture set you're texturing, or else it won't work. So if I try to texture like this, you know, it just disappears. It's not there because I can't texture it because I'm not on the right set. Here's your properties. It's basically going to show the properties of whatever thing you're using at the current. Right now I'm just on layer 4 and I'm in the paint mode, so you have size, flow, opacity. We'll get back to that. So one more thing over here is here you have the texture settings, but you also have the viewer settings. If you just go along the little bar right here, and the viewer settings can sometimes be important and sometimes not. One thing to note is that you can change the maps for the lighting, because right now it's using panorama, which I think is a good enough I think it's a good enough lighting environment map to use for most things. It's just pretty clear and really, you know, it lights everything well enough so you can see it. And some of the other ones can get a bit weird. But you can change the lighting, so that can be helpful for certain circumstances, or if you're trying to texture a very, very specific lighting situation, you can import the map that you're using in Maya. Another thing is environment rotation right here. Sometimes when you're doing your materials, you want to sort of test, like the specularity, how shiny things are, etc. like that. So you can just go to this bar right here and you can see, oh, that's shiny, that's not, this is how that reacts to more light, how this reacts to more light. And there's a shortcut for this, but I'm not going to go over it because too many shortcuts will probably just confuse people.
Is that like a default environment that's put in the background?
Yeah, that's a default environment. The default environment's pretty good, in my opinion. You probably won't have to change it unless you really want specific, like, look development in really specific conditions and you want to make sure it looks exactly right. So those are the menus over here. The menu down here is called the shelf. It is where all of your kind of like texture assets live. So you have your project, your alphas, your, you know, procedurals, grunges, textures, filters, brushes, materials, and smart materials. We'll go over which of these we should go about using in a second. Also, if anybody has any questions or needs anything clarified, just raise your hand. So first now, so how do we actually paint something? So when I have a bunch of stuff in here, but usually when you just bake your textures out and you start, you have just this one blank layer. So I've recreated that here, blank layer. And as you can see, if you just start painting, it comes out white. This is a layer of paint, layer of white paint. To change that, you know, actually, sorry, first thing, probably should go through this menu up here so you know better what I'm doing. By default, it's on Substance Painter will put you on the paint tool. I'm painting, look, wow. If you want to erase, that's right next to it, erase tool. And then all of the attributes for the erase and the paint can be found obviously in the properties. Size, flow, you know, opacity, it'll erase less. Totally really not erasing much at all at this point because the opacity is so low. Things like that, spacing, angle. There are a lot of settings, you can play around with them. So then here we have, this is just when you use particle brushes, which are something special that we're not going to get into right now. This is painting by polygon. So Substance Painter has this cool thing where you can paint just by polygon, which can be helpful in getting across large spaces and getting like clean edges like this. If I wanted this really clean edge right here along my mesh, I could just do that. When you're painting by polygon, the properties are a little different. You can paint by triangle, by quad, or by object. So when you have it on triangle, which is the first one, each of these little quads you see is actually split into a triangle. So it'll, you know, go and get the triangle. Wow. If you're painting in quad, it'll color by quad. And if you click this little cube here, it'll basically just paint the whole mesh. So if you have like a combined object and you're using several, if you're using like something called a UDIM texture, which we're not going to go over, that would be helpful. But you can also just use the other ones to get some nice clean texture painted lines along your geometry. Delete that. So right here we have the smudge tool. Basically you can use it to smudge paint. The eyedropper tool, which can be used to, you know, sample paint colors that you want to, you know, recreate. Right here is symmetry, which can be really useful. So if I want to paint something on this, if I want to paint something on this side of the crane and also have it, you know, mirrored exactly on the other side if I want it to be a mirror copy. And so you can turn that on just by this little button right here. It looks like, you know, you can see the little symmetry plane in the middle. And right next to it you can change which way it's mirroring, X, Y, or Z, depending on which way your model is oriented. This is also why it's important when you're modeling like assets like these, or when you're exporting them, it can be helpful to keep them in like oriented at a 90-degree angle, just so it makes it easier to do these masking these things. So you can hide or show your symmetry plane. It might be helpful to hide it, might be helpful to show it. It's not really too obtrusive to begin with, but you know, your choice. And then the last thing that's pretty convenient about Substance Painter is you can paint in 2D. So right now we have it in 3D space, which is great because you can paint and it's pretty natural. But you can also paint in, if you click on this little square icon, you can paint in 2D only space. So as you can see, this is what my UV map basically looks like, and you can paint here. So if you want to get like a specific pattern or something like that, or you could also click it again, 2D, 3D space. You can like adjust this to be bigger or smaller. It's not working. Okay. And you can see as you're painting in 2D space how it's showing up in 3D space, or as you're painting in 3D space how it's showing up in 2D space, and that can be pretty beneficial depending on like what your model is. And also if you're trying to get into like a really small nook, sometimes it's easier to go into 2D space and do it because you can get that. I don't know why that's happening. Bad.
Is that showing your lighting on the 2D space?
I am not quite sure, to be honest.
Is the back end of it dark? The other side of it?
Oh yeah, it looks like it is.
Oh, that's pretty cool.
Yeah. Substance Painter is great. For now, I'm just going to keep in 3D space. Just, yeah, 3D space because, you know, screen space is important. So now that we've got all the menus going through, we can talk more about just painting in general. So here, let me just erase these things. So when you paint in Substance Painter, the default will be like this white paint, and you can change attributes and things like that in the properties. So if I want to do color, I can just go down, change my base color to, I don't know, red. Why is that doing? Oh wait, no, it's because I still have the mirror on. I forgot about it. It's so unobtrusive that I forgot about it. So you're painting here, and now it's red. Obviously, that's not the only property that's important. Substance Painter, you can change all of these properties about a material if you just keep going down. You always get the brush properties first, and you can collapse these. When you go to the material properties, you can get color, height, rough, metal, normal, and specularity. And these will change the type of paint you're putting onto the model. So right now we're at basically 0 height, low roughness, more specular, and no metallic at all. So you can see the difference if I turn up the roughness to 100, you know, to all the way up to 1, and then I paint. When I get it at the right angle where the light reflects.
Where
the light reflects. Also, this is just a shortcut. I'm just using a shortcut key to rotate the environment, but I'm not going to go over that right now. But you can see that this patch that I painted with the roughness at 0.2 is more shiny because basically roughness is, when you think about roughness, it's like a mirror has very low roughness because when it bounces back light, it bounces it back very directly straight at you. Roughness is when a material has essentially like more jagged edges. If you think about paint, it's actually just tons of like tiny little particles, and those will diffuse light in separate directions, so it won't be as shiny, it won't be as reflective. So you can see how that would affect what you're painting. So if you want it to be more of a shiny thing, you would want to set your roughness all the way down to 0, And wow, look, it's so shiny that it's reflecting the environment map. You can see the sky in it. And then you can, adjust that to whatever kind of whatever thing you want. So the next thing would be metallic. Metallic is like a special property, just to get. It's basically just for you can use it for other things, but it's mainly there for making metals. 0 metallic and then full metallic. You can see that it's kind of taking on this kind of shimmering quality, like the shimmery sheen. It's not quite as flat as these. It's a little hard to tell, but it basically is like it's more metal or it's less metal. It looks more like metal or less like metal, Pretty simple. So the last slider right here would be height. Right now it's at 0, but if I take it all the way up to 1, I'm painting basically height onto my normal map. And when I bake my map out later, like when I export all my textures, it will export with the normal map with this little bump thing. See, as you can see, because it's a normal map and not a displacement map, which Substance Painter doesn't really handle displacement maps, but since it's a normal map, it's not really bumping up, but it gives you the illusion it is, especially if you go from like far away. It kind of seems like, oh, it's like there's some sort of weird divot in here. So if you set height at 0, you're not going to get anything. If you set it at negative 1, it indents instead of outdents. You can see the slight differences. It can be a little tricky to work with, but so those are just the basics. Those are the basics of painting, and changing your materials while you're painting in Substance Painter. It's pretty cool. If at any time things are kind of bugging up or kind of weird, or you're getting like height when you don't want height and you can't seem to fix it, you should be able to fix it with the menu, but you can also turn these channels off. So if I don't want to paint in height at all, I can just turn height off, and it just disappears completely from the menu here, and like I can't access it. So also it works if you don't want to accidentally paint height into something, or you don't want to because sliders can be a bit weird. You can get things. If you want to be absolutely sure that it's flat, then go and turn height off. Or if you don't want to paint in anything but height, like you just want the layer to be painting height and adding height details, you can just turn color off and turn height on, and turn everything else off, and then you can start painting your height details. And that's basically how that works. So when I'm just going to delete that. So to add a new layer for painting, you can just use this little icon right up here. It basically looks like a stack of squares, like a stack of papers, stack of layers, wow. And that will give you a new layer to work on. And you can just, select the layer and press delete. It's pretty simple, a lot like Photoshop. So in order to control your brush, you have the brush options up here, like opacity, size, flow, spacing, etc. But you can also add an alpha to your brush. So first you choose a brush, and I usually, you can choose a brush. Wow. You could also use an alpha, like this kind of brush pattern. And there's a little bit of jitter built into this. This is why it's kind of flowing weirdly. But these will help you define your brush, the shape of your brush in case you want a specific effect. Like you don't want it just to be super smooth, but you want this kind of like jittery brush thing. Use the jittery brush thing. It'll look different. You can adjust like jitter, angle jitter here, so it does less of the moving around as I paint. Or something like this, if you want to like use a corner, like this kind of looks like, how a little bit of grunge would look on a corner, and it's got a sharp edge on the edge, which would be helpful for stuff like that. Erasing everything.
How do you rotate the... Oh, there it is. Rotating the brush.
Oh yeah, you can rotate the brush there. I guess I could show you the hotkeys. It's not super confusing. If you press Control and then you left click, drag your mouse side to side, like left to right, that'll change the flow, and you can see it happening in the properties editor. If you if you Control, left click, and drag your mouse up and down, you can rotate your brush. If you Control right click side to side. That'll control flow instead of opacity, I think. And if you control right click up and down, oh wait, no, sorry, right click up and down, that's why it was weird. You control right click, side to side is actually size. I don't know why I did this, I forgot to press the button. Right click, control side to side is size of brush. Right click, control up and down, sorry, up and down is the, is like this softness around the edges, like the blur around the edges of the brush. Alright, so we have the basics of painting just straight on this down, so I don't know if all you wanted in your scene was to, make a smiley face. Bad smiley face, but there you go, then you're done. But that's probably not all you want to do with your texturing. So what's great about also Control Z is backwards. It's pretty much the same across all programs, but just in case you were wondering. And Control Y is redo, same as Maya. It's weird because the layer system and these things are really like Photoshop, but all of the controls like Control Z, Control Y for redo, and like the and viewport navigation is very Maya because it's a 3D package. Another tip is when you're rotating around the viewport, as you're rotating, if you hit Shift, it'll snap to the closest orthogonal view, which is super helpful if you want to get something super flat on something, or it's very similar to how things work in ZBrush. Or I don't know if Mudbox does it too, it probably does. Right, so that's the alphas. You can use it to define the shape of your brush. You can also just use these special brushes, like Basmati, dirt, if you want to add dirt. See, if I went to color, and I changed the color of my brush to like this kind of brown color, and then I used dirt 1, you're going to get this brush that looks a lot more like dirt, and you can layer it and stuff like that. If you want to manually add dirt to your model, like maybe their face is dirty, I don't know, it gives them character. I'm showing it on a crane sign just because a lot of the things that you can do in Substance Painter I think are better shown on something like this rather than a character. Unless they're made out of like wood. So now I think it would be good to move on to fill layers. So we already covered the normal layer, which is this little button right here. You can add a layer and then you can start drawing on it. A fill layer is really powerful in Substance Painter because you just press this little button right next to it, which is like just like one of those little pouring cups. And you have basically a fill layer. It's, if I go into the color right here and I change the color, you can see that the fill layer changes because it fills the entire mesh with this color, which is really useful for things. As with the paint, you can change the height, roughness, and metallic of the fill layer to get what you want. So if I wanted, this is fine. So when you're working with a fill layer, you usually use a fill layer with masks. So masks are really, really, really useful in Substance Painter. So how you use those is you can like click these buttons. I forgot which button it is. Is it this button? No. It's this button. You can click this. When you're on a layer, you can use this button to add a mask, or you can right click over any of the layers and it brings up an option menu. So let's see what happens when I add a white mask. When I add a white mask, nothing happens because white basically means that it's seen and black means that it's hidden. So black is erase, white is paint usually, and this concept applies itself all around the program. So what I want to do is, if I just click on this is my material basically. The first square is like always the material, and I can change the material attributes. But then if I click on the white square here, that's the mask. So if I set this to white and I paint on this, nothing happens because it's white. It's showing the material. If I go black, you can see that I am basically erasing from the fill layer. But it's good because it's non-destructive. So if I want to delete this mask, oh no, or clear the mask, I can just do that and it's gone. Like I can always get back to this fill layer. So this can also be helpful because Substance Painter is super smart. So what you can add to things like these masks is you can add, let's see, smart masks. And maybe that was not the best one to use. Or dirt. So as you can see, this is these smart masks down here in the shelf, right here, smart masks. They are based off of, if you go back to your texture settings here, they're based off all these maps you baked out at the beginning of your workflow. They can sense what's happening, like, you know, this is Substance Painter's approximation of dirt, because I used a dirt. And all you have to do is take this and kind of drop it into the mask layer right there. And you get this dirt thing. So then you can go and you can see now that when you click on the mask, there's this little thing under it, so it's like kind of like a sub layer for effects. And if you click it, you can get all of these attributes that you can change in order to change the whatever's happening. So global balance is there's more dirt, there's less dirt. The contrast, it's like if it's more contrasty, it's like more concentrated, you know, things like that. And there are a lot of settings to play around with, but we obviously don't have time to look at them all, so we're done with that. Because of Substance Painter's non-destructive workflow, you can just get rid of it by clicking the X. And we go back to our fill layer. Another thing you can do is you can add what's called a generator. And after you do that, you know, nothing changes. But here you have this little generator tab thing. And you click on generator and you could select from one of these. These are like these awesome, really nice, super smart things where, see if I want MG metal edge, this senses the edges. So like if you just want metal rust on your edges, or if you want wear, you can apply this to different materials to get like a wear effect, and I'll show you how that works in a second. So to sum that up, you can have fill layers and use color. So if this was like more of a brown, it'd be like dirt. Look, it's already looking sort of like rust if this was a metal sign. And then you can add a mask, a white mask or a black mask. If you add a black mask, basically you're adding in it, the color, the fill color entirely disappears, and you can add in color. If you're adding a white mask, the fill color stays and you're subtracting from the mask. Right, and then you can use smart masks, which you just drag up to this little mask square, or you can click on it here and add a generator and use like the few really nice generators that they have. So, but I don't want that, so I'm going to get rid of this. Okay, so moving on to materials. Procedural materials in Substance Painter are awesome. They're really awesome. So to do that, you can look, if you go to your shelf and you go down here, right here at the bottom you find materials and smart materials. So we'll go over materials first. Materials are these things that literally you can just take a material and, where's the one I wanted? Oh, it disappeared. It can, this one. You can just take it, a material you want from all of these materials, and you can just come and drag it down here. Don't drag it into a folder if you don't want to. If it's just like a little line, it means you dragged it. So drag this material on top, and wow, look, I have this material applied over my crane sign. And I wanted the crane sign to be more like a series of planks instead of one whole piece of wood, so this works well for me. But as you can see, it's rotated weirdly. You know, why would anybody make a sign like this? It's just not really all that pleasing. So if you click on this, oops, I'll explain that later. If you click on the layer, you can see that you have all of these things. You can use UV projection or triplanar projection. Triplanar projection can sometimes help if your UVs are a little wonky. It will not fix your UVs. You have to make good UVs to begin with, but sometimes if it's a little kind of weird, sometimes triplanar will work better than UV. It depends. So here you have all the settings for how this material lays on your object. Your scale, so you can make these planks bigger or smaller. Bigger or smaller. I want them about, say, here. And then offset is like, this material is pretty long. It's a pretty big material, you know, and so you can move it along the axes, like if you don't like this or you think this is better, something like that. Rotation is, you know, rotating it, so that will be good for me because I want it to be like this vertical sign, right? Also, as you can see, I totally didn't even try to UV the back to look good because in 3D, if you're doing it for games, things have to look good from every angle usually. But if you're doing it for movies, they only need to look good from the angle you're seeing the thing from. And I was not going to be seeing the sign from any other angle, so I totally ignored it. But you can see how a bad UV map totally messes with these textures because it depends. These textures depend on, you know, the checker pattern that we discussed in class before, like how they depend on that for mapping where things should be placed. And so when you have a warped pattern like I have here, and I didn't care, you have warped boards and you have warped materials if you're using procedural materials, which is really crappy. Also, even if you're just painting on something like this, it'll still be wonky and it'll feel really weird painting on it. So make good materials, especially if it's for games. I mean, make good UVs, especially if it's for games. So look, so I have this plank thing right here, but I'm not really super into the look of it. I want it to look different. It's just, you know, you shouldn't really use I mean, you can use materials right out of the box, you know, just drag them on, but Substance Painter is really powerful, and that can lead people to just kind of throw stuff on and not really think about things. Substance Painter being powerful is not an excuse to cheat about your art. Like, you need to think about these things, like aesthetically what's pleasing, mixing materials together, etc., etc. So for example, this is something I made recently for my portfolio. I used a lot, this whole thing was made in Substance Painter, and I used a wood texture for the wood right here, but being cognizant when you're making these things of what colors look good next to what colors metals normally are, like, you know, I don't want to make this engine totally like iron or something because it's not iron. And also thinking about the wear and tear that your texture has been through. So for example, the wood right here, it's procedural wood, but I went in and I added dirt manually. I did use like some generator, some smart mass, but it didn't do what I wanted it to do. So I manually went in and added dirt. So you see that it would make sense that if the wheel is flowing right here, then the dirt would go up this post, at least as far as the wheel would go, because it'd be flinging dirt around. Or at least that's what I think would happen, and that's how my logic works. But that's what you want to be doing when you're using Substance Painter, not just slapping on materials. Because when you're showing these things to professionals, they've all seen, like, this is a big program. They've all seen these textures before. They can tell that you didn't do anything to it and that you're just slapping things on. So here's my old painted planks, and I want to go do things that are different. Smart materials right here, the other important thing. Regular materials just lay over your UV. They really don't sense anything. They're not, you know, they're not smart. So a smart material like this would be, let's say if I use this bronze corrugated and I just dragged it up here, I got this corrugated bronze sign now. But if I look at it right here, there's a little bit of wear around the edges. This is smart enough to sense what's going on. This material is smart enough to sense what's going on in my like from the geometry and from the maps on my model. So, and they also have more settings. So smart materials are basically just folders, really fancy folders for all of these things. So anybody can make any of these smart materials here just from fill layers, maps, and things in Substance Painter, which we're not going to go over because it's a complicated process. But just to let you know, that's what it is. It's not some super fancy algorithm. It's being really smart about using all these maps and things. So you could do this by hand, like just without the smart material. But the smart material is there to use if you want to, and because it's simpler. And so you can go on and you can go to each of these little things and adjust, you know, like color, or like if you click on the mask, you can go to the mask and see, you know, how is this working? How is this going to change things? And a really fun thing to do is you can take these and you can just like drag them out And you can start, if you go into the Smart Materials, a cool way to make materials without having, like, you should definitely at some point familiarize yourself with exactly how to make things with masks, like make materials with masks, etc. in Substance Painter. But a fun way to do it without having all of that pre-knowledge is to just look at what you like from certain materials. Smart Materials, go into their folders, look at the things you like, and you can mix and match things. Like if I like the dirt drips from here, and I totally don't want the bronze, I can just delete the bronze and have the dirt drips still. They're still there, there's still something that happens, and I can drag that into, I can make this, and I could, you know, here you can create a folder here, create a folder, and put that in there. Make your own materials and make things happen. Right. But those are Smart Materials. They're basically they're basically smarter, more customizable materials. The regular materials, they have very few features. You can always, you know, adjust the way they lay on your mesh, but they have very few features. Smart Materials have a lot of features. They're very, very adjustable, and you can get a lot of cool results from them and really different results from each material just by tweaking things. And you should tweak things. Just don't use them straight out of the box. Right, so what I want is I like this really like visceral, planky feeling I get from this thing, but I don't really like the texture. So, by the way, this is what my finished crane sign looked like before. I don't really like the texture at all, so I'm going to take this Dirty Wood Smart Material and drag it in above my old painted wood. So I kind of like the look of that wood better, and what I want is I want the sign to be painted, but I want a little bit of wood texture to show through, and I wasn't really satisfied with this wood texture because it's, you know, it's already pre-painted, but I like the plankness of it. So what I can do is I can go to Dirty Wood and go to Fill Layer and, you know, rotate it so it's, you know, less weird. And something you can do in Substance Painter is you have this little bar up here, base color, height, roughness, metallic, normal, specular. Substance Painter is like Photoshop, so you can blend layers. So if I have Dirty Wood up here and I go to this little bar, I can blend how much, like the opacity of the layer basically. And I can also change the mode just like in Photoshop from normal to multiply, all these things that you should not worry about right now. So you can blend between these using opacity, but as you can see, this is only the color opacity. This is what this menu bar is about up here. Color opacity, when you're on base color and you're sliding these sliders, it is only affecting the color channel. It's not affecting the specularity channel, it's not affecting the roughness channel or anything else. And this is great because you can really fine-tune your materials on separate channels and get everything to work exactly the way you want it to. Because you have these layers, it's also non-destructive, so you can always go back and change these things. Substance Painter overall is non-destructive, which is great. So if I go to height, I'm going to go to my Dirty Wood, which is the wood on top, and I'm going to dial my height down to 0 because I don't want any of the height detail to show up really. I just want kind of like this like this just a nice wood material. There's a problem where this wood material has already is planked. It has this kind of plank-like nature, but I didn't like it as much as the other one. And that could be a problem if you're going to show the sign straight like this. But for the purposes I'm using it for, it's not a problem because I'm going to be applying paint over most of this. So if I go back to base color, because I like to stay in base color, I'm going to go down under the Dirty Wood, and I decide that I don't really like the dirt that's been applied over here. So I'm going to just delete it. So the dirt's gone, and I like that better. I'm going to add my own dirt later. So now I'm going to add a fill layer, which turned out here, and I'm going to drag that out so it's up here. So you can see that the fill layer went on. See, I did bad UVing because I knew you would only see the sign from this angle, and I had a lot of things to do, so horrible UVing, but you can get away with it if that's what you need it for. But, you know, do good UVing on your characters because you're going to be seeing them from every angle. So now the fill layer is on here and it's covered the whole thing in paint, but it's taken on the height attributes of my old painted planks layer because I still have that turned on to 100%. So I want paint that is like a little more rough. I don't want it too specular, you know, more like house paint. Because I could have it, you know, really shiny, glossy paint. It looks like, you know, it's just been painted, but I want it to be more rough. And now I want to add a white mask to my paint. Actually, let me go back to the fill layer. I don't want this. I want this to be like, I don't know, less like that red color. So if I go to my mask, you know, I can start drawing on the mask like this. To get some nice like detail, I could go into my brushes or my alphas, and I could get this brush rotation and like something like that, or brush stroke, kind of like create some wear, go into my brushes, grab a dirt brush, and start like creating it. Like this obviously doesn't look realistic because paint doesn't chip that way, but you know, for an example, I want the paint to look like it's worn off in this way. You want to be thinking about how materials react in real life because, you know, paint doesn't chip this way, but let's just assume that it does. So let's say that I want to make like I want to paint over this again. So I add another fill layer, and this time I want it to be black. And let's say I apply a black mask to it. If I apply a black mask, you can't see it at all. But if I go back in and draw, and let's not use that, let's use this. If I go back in and draw, it's like, oh, okay, this is how I painted this. I can make this smaller and rotate it so it looks like I've painted. I've been like, I just went in and I painted this instead of just random really clean layers. So this is totally awful looking, but that's basically the idea. You're going to go in and you're going to create a lot of fill layers, create a lot of normal layers, use your masking, and try to reveal different sides of things. You can see right now that this is more specular. The black is more specular and more shiny than the red because I set the red to be less specular. So I can go back and set the roughness higher, or I could just leave it shiny and say I used two different types of paint, you know? What you can do is you can also copy and paste these layers. So if you right click above any layer, you have a bunch of options. You can invert masks and etc. But important to know is copy and paste layers and duplicate layers. If you copy a layer, you can copy it and then like paste it onto this thing, which is not going to really work because it's not even close to the same thing. Because that wasn't really a smart material, so it doesn't really reapply itself well. But if you took dirty wood and you copied it and you pasted it onto Lambert 5, which is this pole, you would get a weird wooden pole. So that's really helpful, especially if you're working between things with similar materials. Like you create a material by fiddling around that you really like and you want to transfer that to somewhere else. You can just copy that material and paste that material, and it's all great. In addition to that, smart materials you can also add. You can also add masks too. If I add a white mask and then I go in, I'm showing some of the wood underneath that smart material. You can add masks to like any of these things, and masks are basically one of the cruxes of Substance Painter. So, okay, don't have much time left. Let's see what else there is. If you want to make, let's see, a big layer of dirt. So let's see if I go up here, click this layer, and then create a new fill layer. I want to make this like a brown. It's a greenish brown. Let's see, more red brown. Right, so I have this brownish thing, and as we said before, add a white mask, and you could do manual dirt, which is just, actually, it's better as black mask. If you want to add manual dirt, I made, this brown fill layer, and I have this, and I added a black mask. So now I can just go in with this dirt brush, or, this dirt brush or that dirt brush, all these brushes, and I can just, like, start drawing in this dirt because I'm revealing it from behind the hidden black because this is white right now. And you can always go in and erase any of these changes too, but I just don't have time for that. So I made this dirt here. Otherwise, you can also go in and, you know, add a generator, like I said before, or, you know, drag a mask on. But if I add a generator and then I go to generator, MG dirt, you have like this really thin layer of dirt that it smartly generated for you, and you can, you know, increase the level of dirt or not. And that can also be done with several different types of smart masks as well. Okay, so you're looking at this and you're like, oh wow, I think it looks good, but I wish things were a little bit sharper. You can go into your texture settings, scroll to the top, and you can change the size of your map. And this works really well in Substance Painter because it's a non-destructive workflow. When you change the size, it like calculates everything you've done all over again, but on a bigger size. So we started off at 1024 when we made our object, and that's good to start off with because Substance Painter can get a little bit slow and laggy. It might even crash if you start off too high. But if I want to go to 2K, I can go click on 2K over here. You can see Substance Painter is recalculating this, and we'll just wait a second while it recalculates. And bam, wow, you just get more of this wood detail in here. Your dirt is a little bit sharper, and so you can see better how this is affecting your mesh, which is really awesome and helpful. So there are also things like stencils in here, but I'm not sure, I don't really think I have time to get into it. You can use stencils to like airbrush essentially patterns on, maybe I can do it really, really quickly. You can use stencils to essentially airbrush patterns onto your material. So if you have, I guess this is a good way to do this. Right here you can import materials and things like that using this little thing that looks like an arrow and a box. It's not labeled, you're just going to have to remember it. You can add resources. If I go to my desktop and I go to folder I have for this, and I have this resource stencil that I just got off of Google, it will appear right here, and I can drag this onto my stencil thing. Stencil, wow, look, now I have a stencil. And this is an overlay that you can use to get patterns, you know, logos, etc., things like that. So you can still manipulate everything normally here with the standard controls. If you want to control the stencil itself, instead of using, so when you navigate around the viewport, you use Alt, you know, right click, middle click, left click to navigate. It's the same thing except you hold down S instead, so S for stencil, and you can see that it gets, you know, bigger, and Alt, you know, Alt normal click is rotating it, Alt right click is scaling it, and Alt middle click is moving it around. So then when I paint over it, you can see that I'm getting this pattern. So white is stuff that goes through, that shows, you know, shows the pattern, and black is the stuff that's emitted. So you can see that I'm getting this really nice, cool pattern here. Wow.
You would change the opacity of your stencil?
You know, I'm not quite sure. I can't remember. I haven't used stencils in a while for anything. There's probably a way, but I cannot remember right now. Something else is that, wow, if you go and you enable your height again, and you do up your height, when you stencil it, you can get height information from your stencil as well. So getting these nice patterns, if you had like a slightly like raised pattern on something, that's a really cool feature you can get. And to get rid of the stencil, basically all you do is go back to your layer properties and X out of the stencil. And wow, look, you're back to this, and you have this really cool stencil-y thing going on here. Alright, 7 minutes left. I think I went through as much as I could possibly do in this one class period. But last thing is how to export materials. Oh, actually, one more thing before last thing. Substance Share is this website that the company that made Substance Painter, Allegorithmic, maintains. And people basically, you can submit substances you make in Substance Painter or this other program, Substance Designer. And they can approve it, and then they put it here, and you can download all of these great smart materials that they don't have in... No, does this not clicking? That they just don't have in Substance Painter, that don't ship with the material. So I don't... Okay, this is annoying, but if you click on one of these things... so the ones that are just circles are normal materials. The ones with this funny little sphere thing are smart materials. But if you click on it, you can download these. And you can use them in Substance Painter by just going back into this import and importing like the material instead. And that will import into your shelf, and you can use that. So there are like tons and tons of materials and resources you can use that the Substance community has been compiling for like ever. It's really great. So take advantage of that, but as always, you have to remember to be smart about it. Like, people have seen these materials. People are really into Substance Painter. People who are textures are really into Substance Painter. They know what a standard material looks like. They know when you just take something from somebody else's website. They've seen all these materials because they've used them. So it's really, 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 really important to remember that you have to make these things your own. You have to make the materials your own and the design your own. Don't just like slapdash things on, because it won't look good and it will look very, very generic. Right. So last thing is when you want to export all... Oh my gosh, what? When you want to export these textures, you go to File, Export Textures. Here you can choose where these exports to. So I usually make a folder especially for my texture maps. You can choose, the type of image you want, how big it is, configuration. For RenderMan, for Arnold 5, you're going to want to use PBR Metal Rough. And then you can see the maps that this will output. And then you can change how big you want your maps to be. I'd say 2048 would be a good one. Even if you don't change your size here to a higher resolution in the texture set, you can still export them in a higher resolution. Substance Painter will calculate all that out for you. You just won't see it before, like what it looks like before it's exported out, but you can export it at a higher resolution here. And then you just click Export, and it exports. On the class website, I posted under resources, basically under tutorials. If you guys remember, every time something new happens, I post new things. This is apparently how you connect things, but it hasn't been working for me, so ignore this for now. But this is, this link on top specifically is a really good link. It's very, very current, and it's how this one guy works. It's an entire... It talks about his artistic workflow. It's really long, and it goes step by step through how he does his UVs, his maps, everything. It's a really good thing to read if you're really interested in Substance Painter. It goes through everything. It shows his workflow, which is different than our workflow because it's a little bit more complicated, but it's really, really, really interesting and super long, but really, really informative. Yeah. So I put that resource up, and I'll try to get more tutorials up on this site too, but that's Substance Painter.